good evening. In the news this Thursday, there was a bombing at an airlines office in London. European ministers agreed to share intelligence on terrorists. Denmark tossed out some Libyan diplomats, and the Saudi oil minister said oil prices will continue to fall. We will have the details in our news summary in a moment. Charlene Hunter-Gault is in New York tonight. Charlene?
After the summary of today's news, this is our NewsHour lineup. Our first focus is a look at the broader terrorism network beyond Libya. Two experts see it differently. In our continuing series on drugs, we focus on the problem among some of America's heroes, professional athletes, and the debate over what to do about it. And we get readings on South Africa's latest and biggest reform proposal from the South African ambassador and an official of the African National Congress.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T. Whether it's telephones, information systems, long-distance services, or computers, AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Terrorists today kept up their assault on British targets. A bomb exploded outside a British Airways office on Oxford Street in a busy shopping area of central London. No one was killed or seriously injured in the early morning blast, but damage was severe. We have a report from Mike Smart of the BBC.
The bomb, which went off without warning at 10 to 5, was left on the pavement outside the British Airways office. It started a fire inside and broke scores of windows, including one high up in the Selfridges building on the opposite side of Oxford Street. Police also searched high and low to check whether any more devices or booby traps had been left. Forensic experts spent most of the morning sifting through the debris. At least two organisations, the Scottish National Liberation Army and a group called the Angry Brigade, have claimed responsibility. And the police say they're also investigating claims from other groups, though they won't confirm whether any is linked with Libya.
The government of Denmark expelled 5 of the 11 Libyan diplomats in their country. A spokesman said it was because of Libya's support for terrorism. It followed Monday's common market decision to impose diplomatic sanctions on Libya.
The 12 European Common Market countries agreed to share information about terrorism with each other and the United States. The information will include the names of suspects, information about stolen passports, and incidents involving security at airports. And Libya threatened to take what it called appropriate measures against the Common Market for the diplomatic sanctions that were agreed upon earlier this week. The Libyans did not say what measures they had in mind.
A key Palestinian guerrilla leader said today he was organizing new terrorist actions against the United States and Israel. Abu Abbas is the man's name. He is accused of masterminding the MacNeil-Lehrer hijacking, among other things. He told the Reuters news service in a telephone interview a secret meeting of revolutionary groups would be held soon to plan the attacks. He said targets would be military and economic, not civilian. In Lebanon, 7 French teachers left Muslim West Beirut as Westerners continued to flee and face a feared violence against them.
In Afghanistan, rebel commanders said their troops were suffering heavy losses in Soviet and Afghan government air raids on rebel positions in the southeastern part of the country. And in Washington, a group close to the rebels said they had begun using American-made Stinger missiles. That confirmed reports that the U.S. was planning to supply the anti-aircraft missiles for the first time.
An oil import tax and higher gasoline taxes were put back on the federal budget table today. Senate Budget Committee Chairman Pete Domenici released a Congressional Budget Office report which said such measures would raise $10 billion in new revenue. He strongly urged President Reagan to consider supporting them, something Mr. Reagan has thus far said he will not do. In Geneva today, the Saudi Arabian oil minister said the price of oil is going to drop even more unless non-OPEC countries cooperate. Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani said in a speech, OPEC countries have reduced their production, but the others have not. So you must ask the other side about stability and prices, he said.
That's the end of our news summary. Still to come on the News Hour, a broader look at terrorism beyond Libya with two experts who see it differently. In our continuing series on drugs, we focus on what to do about drug problems among some of America's heroes, professional athletes, and we debate what is being called the most significant South African reform since World War II with that country's ambassador and an official of the African National Congress.
Today's news litany on terrorism. A bomb exploded on Oxford Street in central London. European ministers agreed to share terrorist information. Denmark expelled 5 Libyans. Several French teachers fled West Beirut. A Palestinian leader threatened new terrorist acts against the United States and Israel. Yesterday was the videotape of a hanged British writer in Lebanon and President Reagan's threat to strike Syria and Iran, as well as Libya again. We look again at what is happening and why with two experts who see it mostly very differently. Michael LEDEEN, a senior fellow at the Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies and a consultant to the National Security Council on counterterrorism, and FOUAD AJAMI, professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Gentlemen, first, this question of the Syrian and Iranian connection to terrorism. Mr. LEDEEN, what is it?
Oh, it's multifold, and we probably don't know all about it. The Syrians have created their own terrorist organization, which is called SICA. They've given considerable support to Abu Nidal, especially over the last couple of years when he moved out of Iraq. And they've supported various Palestinian factions from time to time. The Iranians have supported the Hezbollahis in Lebanon, who have done a great deal of damage to us, and they have some of their own terrorists running around the world, largely in Western Europe. So it's substantial.
What are their goals? What is their purpose?
Well, they're different. In each case, they're trying to advance their own national interest through terrorism. President Assad of Syria has been extraordinarily successful in doing this. He's driven most of the Western world out of Lebanon. Khomeini, after all, overthrew the Shah, in part through the use of terrorism, and his desire is to roll back the clock 1,000 years all over the world. He wants to restore the 9th century or thereabouts.
Mr. AJAMI, is there any counter evidence on that? You disagree with that, the fact of Syria and Iran being involved in terrorism?
No, not really. I mean, I think we know that this terror phenomenon goes beyond Muammar al-Gaddafi. I think the Reagan administration had decided, for convenient reasons, to pick on the weakest link in this chain of terror. America has been targeted by terrorist attacks since, particularly in the aftermath of the Lebanon War of 1982. If you begin with the American embassy explosion in Beirut in April 1983, we've now had 3 years of incredible terror. And the terror has had many sources. It has had Libyan sources, Syrian sources, Iranian sources, Lebanese sources, Palestinian sources. So it's a very large world out there, and we've decided in some way to pick on Muammar al-Gaddafi, but it's a story much larger than Gaddafi.
But all of these groups are not coordinated, correct? I mean, Syria might do something on their own for their own interests, Iran on their own for their interests, Libya and so on. Is that what both of you would agree to that?
Well, I think so. I mean, like, if you take a look at the Syrian position, I don't think that today you can look at terrorist acts today and probably implicate the Syrians. If you go back immediately...
Why is that?
Well, you see, because in a way we picked on the Syrians. We challenged the Syrian position in Lebanon in 1982 and after 1982. If you go back to the immediate aftermath of the 1982 war, when America was on the ground in Lebanon, then the Syrians were committed to driving America out of Lebanon and to dramatizing to the Americans the cost of the Lebanon war and the cost of a great American involvement on the side of Israel. So I think if you take a look at the explosion of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, maybe you could say, well, this was a Syrian deed. If you take a look at the big explosion on October of '83 of the Marine barracks in Beirut, you could also say that this is a Syrian decision. The Syrians would have done it with cool reason of state behind it. They had specific objectives, and the objective was to underline the fact that Lebanon was a Syrian sphere of influence.
What is your reading of what the Syrians are up to now, Mr. LEDEEN? You agree?
Well, I agree with the facts. I disagree with the interpretation. After all, American forces were in Lebanon to maintain a peace that Syria ostensibly supported. We were there primarily to save the PLO Syria doesn't much like the PLO, doesn't want a Palestinian state, wanted not only us out of Lebanon, but the Palestinians out of Lebanon also, and directed this violence against us.
But what are they doing now?
Well, they continue to support a fair amount of terrorism worldwide. It's not just restricted to the Middle East, after all.
But what kinds of things is Syria supporting now? What kind of terrorist acts are they behind?
I must tell you that we're not entirely certain. In the recent events, the recent murders of Americans and British and French and so forth in Lebanon, whether and to what extent there is a Syrian role. There's some question about this.
All right, then, Mr. AJAMI, if there is no overall approach here, why is it then, as a result of the Libyan raid, the people apparently supported by Syria who are holding the Westerners in Lebanon killed several of them, hung one yesterday, and showed the videotape? What's the connection then?
Well, Jim, it's not the company I travel in. I don't know what the connection is, but here's the dilemma. We went into Libya. Now, the Libyans had to respond. The cheapest form of response, the cheapest place to respond would probably be a response in Beirut. There is an irony here, and it was an irony that one of the Lebanese leaders noted, that the Libyans will protect foreigners and will protect Americans and Americans who are working in the oil fields of Libya so long as they are in Tripoli, Libya. But the foreigners, the Westerners who are in Beirut are a fair target. You see, it's because there is a great deal of anarchy in Lebanon, and you can't hold anyone responsible in Lebanon. There's no government to speak of. So if the Americans were to respond, for example, or the British were to respond to the murder of British citizens in Lebanon, who would you hold responsible in Lebanon? It's a vast anarchic world. The Syrians have a piece of it, the Iranians have a piece of it, the Libyans probably have a very small piece of Beirut. If you pay for a piece of the action in Lebanon, you can get it.
Well, I must say that this business of holding no one responsible for murders when we know who have committed them is outrageous. Look, what happened in Lebanon was that common criminals had taken several of these hostages hostage, and they were holding them primarily for purposes of making money. It was just brigadism. The Libyans had been trying for a very long time to buy these hostages from these common criminals, and finally succeeded in
literally
buying them. And finally, after the bombing attack in Libya, not in response to it because this had been going on for a long time, they finally obtained them, executed them, and delivered the bodies. That's the kind of thing that's going on. And all of this talk about high ideological goals and so forth, in many of these cases, is just simply not true.
You buy that?
Yes, I mean, the line between plunder on the one hand and great ideology on the other is very thin. And you can have groups that talk about God and the ways of God. You can also have them engage in this kind of business that Mr. LEDEEN is talking about. They're holding a vanishing capital. When you're holding Westerners in Beirut today, their governments are not really that interested in them. They haven't come looking for them. And if you're holding them, if Gaddafi is interested in them, and if you will pay for them, you can probably secure them.
Well, look, on the other hand, what you have, Gaddafi wrote a book, The Green Book, in which he said many years ago, more than a decade ago, that the purpose of his regime was to unleash terrorism against the Western world because he wishes to destroy it. Any kind of terrorism is good for him. He says there's red terrorism, there's black terrorism, and there's green terrorism, left-wing, right-wing, and Islamic. All of it is good, so long as it's directed against the West. So if you want to focus on one event or another, you miss the point. These are regimes which, for one reason or another, use terror as an integral part of their national strategy, which is aimed against the West. And that is the problem that we have to deal with. And I'm afraid that when we focus on one event or another, whether it's a major event like the invasion of Lebanon, or a relatively minor event in the course of world history like the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, we will miss the point. These are terrorist regimes.
All right, now, President Reagan said yesterday that the United States was prepared to strike Syria and Iran, just like he did Libya, if the evidence is that conclusive. What do you think of that approach?
Well, I don't think the president, I think he probably was improvising. That's my own guess. Is the president willing to take on Damascus? We've tried this.
As a matter of fact, I happen to have been at this particular briefing where he answered that question. And it seemed like it was a prepared answer in case he was asked that question, just for what it's worth. But go ahead.
Well, my own feeling is that, again, in this large shadowy world of terror, we've decided to take a club and go after a shadow. We have, we've looked, who's the culprit in this world of terror. Now, if we take on the Syrians, we have to know what we're doing. If we take on the Syrians, we take on indirectly. There is a Soviet insurance policy that the Syrians have. The Libyans had no such insurance policy. The Syrians have a formidable army. The Libyans did not have a formidable army. I think there would be much greater reluctance to take on the Syrians. We've tried taking on the Syrians in the Fertile Crescent over Lebanon before, from 1982 until 1984, and we know that they are formidable enemies. So I think there would be much greater reluctance to answer the Syrians than there has been in the case of Libya.
Empty words then, Mr. LEDEEN?
No, but a very serious problem. Fouad's entirely right. Syria is a serious problem. Iran is also a serious problem. Libya is a country of 2 to 3 million people with a small army and a small air force and no real capacity to strike worldwide at us. Syria and Iran, on the other hand, are major countries. Syria with a first-class army, Iran probably not so fine any longer, but still with a lot of money, a lot of capacity, a professional intelligence organization, all the like. What this means is that if we're going to go after Syria and Iran, as Libya really, we need policies. And the goal of the policy has to be either to reach some kind of settlement with these regimes whereby they abandon terrorism as a weapon of policy against us, or we try to replace them with something more civilized. And those are serious questions and can't be resolved by dropping bombs here or there or single strikes against one country or another.
Well, what's the answer then, gentlemen?
Well, there's really no answer. I mean, Mr. LEDEEN is talking about replacing these regimes with something more civilized. I don't know how we would go to Iran and replace a theocratic regime firmly entrenched in place and replace it with some alternative. I mean, what's the alternative? We have no alternative. Is there a democratic alternative, if you will, in Syria to Hafiz Assad? There isn't one. Is there a democratic alternative, a democratic pro-Western alternative in Iran to the regime of Ayatollah Khomeini? And I don't think there is one. So I think we're witnessing the frustrations of a great power. A great power is being targeted. American citizens are being targeted. And there is really no effective answer. When we respond and we answer the Libyans, again, our own expectations, probably. The Reagan administration's expectations, I don't know, maybe they thought that with this, now this world of terror out there will be disciplined. And I think we can see the fault of this kind of logic.
Do you think that the U.S. raid on Libya, Mr. LEDEEN, has had any kind of a disciplining effect on Libya?
We don't know yet. We don't know all the effects of the bombing raid on Libya. First of all, the bombing raid on Libya has certainly shaken the regime of Gaddafi. That by now is clear to anyone who's in Tripoli, all the information that we're getting, whether the press or other sources. And in any event, the bombing raid against Libya doth not an anti-terrorist policy make. It was the first act by the United States after 10 to 15 years of absorbing one terrorist attack after another. It was the first occasion on which we chose finally to enter the war. What has changed now is that it's a two-sided war. And one can't either praise or condemn the Reagan administration for the first step. We're going to have to look at this over a period of years.
But both of you are saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that that same kind of policy, that same kind of action against Libya is not going to work against Iran or Syria. Something else is going to have to come.
Well, I don't think it was sufficient against Libya in the first place. It was only a first step. Many more things will have to be done. And it certainly won't be sufficient against countries like Iran and Syria.
But do you think that would be an adequate first step against Syria? I mean, what about dropping a bomb in Syria and Iran if we got some kind of definite proof of their tie-in to a terrorist act against the United States or American citizens, say, in the next few days?
Listen, I believe it's folly to try to discuss in advance specifically what kinds of steps should be taken. But I think what has to be kept in mind is the objective of the policy. The objective of the policy must be either to reach some kind of arrangement with these regimes whereby this kind of terrorism goes away by mutual agreement, or that we bring so much pressure to bear on these regimes that it must abandon it, or it gets replaced with something more civilized.
You're talking about diplomatic pressure, economic pressure. You're not talking about military pressure.
I'm talking about the full range of pressure, military, paramilitary, whether it's mining of harbors, whether it's embargoes against countries, whether it's commando strikes against terrorist training camps, whatever it may be.
Do you think Syria, let's say Syria specifically, could be pressured into stopping terrorism against the United States?
Well, look, I mean, if the Syrians are involved in a particular act of terror, we will just wait and we will have to wait and see. But I mean, I think the larger issue, the American position, is really untenable. Look at how the American position in the area shapes up. The friends of America, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and so on, the moderate Arab regimes, are vulnerable and terrified of this large radical wave sweeping the region. The enemies of America, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Shia of Lebanon, and so on, the radical Palestinians, they're relentless. And I think it's the American position that we've been witnessing, the tearing asunder of the American position in the Arab world and the Muslim world by and large.
Gentlemen, on that not terribly optimistic note from both of you, we have to leave it. Thank you.